Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program from Washington. On today's show, the gun violence in the U.S. Our guest, Ladd Everett, Director of Communications of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence. Mr. Everett, a warm welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Mr. Everett, Lee McFaul, in an article, he says, the United States doesn't have a gun problem. It has a violence problem. The gun control debate is and always has been a form of scapegoating. The problem is not guns. The problem is not ultimately racial hatred, although that issue is far more important than guns. He says, the problem is that people are addicted to violence as a method of solving problems, and so they tend to look at the symptoms of the problem to the exclusion of its cause. Do you agree?
I don't think I do agree with that. I've heard that proffered as a theory, but really what distinguishes the United States when you compare us to other high-income nations is the fact, well, number one, we have an astronomically higher gun death rate specifically, and then we also have a higher overall homicide rate, but that higher overall homicide rate is really triggered by the level of gun death we have in this country. For example, if you were to compare us with a nation like Britain, for example, we have a gun death rate that's 50 times higher, a homicide rate that's more than 3 times higher, but a violent crime rate that's pretty similar. The violent crime rate when you compare us to other industrialized nations is not that far off. So I don't think I've ever been convinced we're necessarily more violent. I think what distinguishes Americans is that when we have those moments where we lapse into violence, too often we have firearms immediately at hand, and they make those instances more lethal.
Precise about that. Walter Hickey, in a publication called The Business Insider, says, the United States is truly an exceptional nation, he said, but it's not because of our education system, our economy, or our scientific establishment. No. The United States, it's only exceptional when it comes to the number of guns, the frequency of gun murders, and the shockingly high number of annual gun deaths. Other countries don't have America's gun problem. And I'm asking you, for you, this is shameful for America, or for you this is normal?
Well, I can tell you that the reason I got involved in this issue is because it is personally shameful. As an American, I am embarrassed by the fact that we allow this level of gun death and gun murder to continue in this country. So, I mean, I think those comments reflect my thinking on the issue for sure. There's no reason that this need happen in this country. We could have addressed this problem decades ago, like other, again, industrialized societies have done, and we've just chosen not to do so, or Americans of conscience, let's say, have struggled to do so because of the power of the gun lobby in this country, and also, admittedly, to a degree, because of the power of the gun culture in this country. There is a gun culture in this country. And
I want to bring to your attention another comment. That one is made by Dr. Joy Osofsky, that's from the Louisiana State University. And the doctor mentions that in the past decade, quote, violence in the United States has been characterized as a public health epidemic. And she wrote a report on children exposure to violence in the media, through television, movies, and internet. And the doctor indicates that the typical, and I quote, the typical American child by the age of 18 will have seen 16,000 simulated murders and 200,000 acts of violence. Commercial television for children is 50 to 60 times more violent than the primetime programs for adults, and some cartoons, she says, average more than 80 violent acts per hour. Worrisome.
It is worrisome, and certainly the glorification of firearms is reflected in popular culture and media in this country. But again, take it in context, because the same violent video games that our kids are playing, the same violent movies that they're watching, kids in other high-income nations are watching. Children in Japan are watching and consuming all of the same media. Children in South America, in Europe, and again in those countries, we're not seeing the level of gun death. I think it's one thing. To go out, watch a violent movie, to embrace that type of fantasy. It's another, though, to come to a home where loaded weapons are readily available to children. That's when I think some of these potential fantasies become very dangerous. So, and other countries just don't allow that.
And in your website,
Yeah.
It's published a quote of Oliver Ellsworth. He is a drafter of the U.S. Constitution and was the third Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And it's quoted, and he said, the American people, a people cannot long retain their freedom whose government is incapable of protecting them. And the director of the NRA, Wayne LaPierre, he said, the people have a right to take whatever measures necessary, including force, to abolish oppressive government. So this is a real beginning of the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm so happy that you brought out that quote, because really this is too many people don't understand that this is really a broader debate about the merits of government itself. The gun culture in this country really, almost to a radical extent, embraces anarchy. It's almost as if they are questioning the merits and value of government itself. And I think what Ellsworth is getting at is what is well understood in other industrialized nations, which is that the primary duty of any government, the first duty of any government, is to protect its people. If a government can't protect its people, it's not likely to remain a government much longer. And I think the NRA in this country, due to propaganda...
The National Rifle Association.
Yeah, the National Rifle Association, due to decades of propaganda, has convinced many Americans, that government is their enemy, and that what is suitable in society is essentially for private individuals, citizens, to arm themselves to the teeth and to use those weapons as a threat against the very existence of their government. I think for America's founding fathers, I think this would have been something truly disturbing, and they would have, I think, immediately understood it as a threat to their work, because the two poles that scared them so much was tyranny on one hand, which was oppressive government, but then on the other hand, they talked equally as much about the threat of anarchy, because during the early American period when we were under the Articles of Confederation, there was a great deal of internal unrest and rebellion in this country that really threatened the Union itself. So I'm glad you brought that out, because really the meaning of government and why do we have government and what is the value it brings is really at the heart of what we're debating around guns in this country.
And that makes also America different from other countries that do not have that if you clause in the Constitution.
Absolutely. Well, I think it goes beyond the Second Amendment, because I think it's not just about, we can debate what the Second Amendment means, and I certainly don't believe it means what the National Rifle Association says it means.
What do you think it means and what they think they mean?
Well, what I would say that it means, if you look at it in chronological history, remember that the Bill of Rights and the Second Amendment come after the drafting and ratification of the Constitution. And what we did with the Constitution, what our founders did with the Constitution that scared people who were skeptical of government, was they gave a tremendous amount of control to the federal Congress to manage the state militia, to organize, train, and equip that militia. And people who at that time were anti-federalists, people who were skeptical about the power of federal government, brought up a good point, I think, at that time, that if the federal government was given the power to arm the state's militia, why couldn't they simply withhold arms and disarm them? And then if you have an oppressive government, you have a very dangerous situation there for the states. So with the Second Amendment, James Madison, who drafted it, a Federalist, was essentially trying to balance control of the militia between the federal government and the states, or the states with their private citizens, by allowing private individuals to basically maintain, upkeep, and own firearms for the purpose of serving in the militia, which at that time was a serious civic duty. It wasn't, hey, come out and train and drill and muster with us if you want to, it's up to you. It was more like you could be punished for not doing your service. And this was a time when there was no organized law enforcement, a time when the militia fought in our foreign conflicts, so they were integral to American society. But now, look, 200 plus years later, the fear behind the Second Amendment, which was a standing army, a federal government with a standing army, well, now we have the largest standing army in the entire world. No one fears our military anymore. They're the most trusted institution in America in one national opinion poll after the next. And then the other thing has changed, that today's organized militia, our National Guard, does not, you don't buy a gun at the gun show and then come out and serve in Iraq in the Guard. The federal government issues all the weapons for people serving in our organized militia today, and when you're done with that service, you turn them back into the federal government. So kind of, the primary, and I think at those times very reasonable fears that motivated the Second Amendment have withered away entirely today. The NRA, though, has explained the Second Amendment in a way that we would call insurrectionist, by trying to convince people essentially that the Second Amendment gives them a right to stockpile firearms against their own government to be used when they personally believe our government has become tyrannical.
And do you believe that the interpretation that says of the Second Amendment by the NARA, it has a business connotation? We're talking about money, or we're talking about philosophical differences?
Well, I think you need to understand that insurrectionist ideology is a tool that the NRA uses to drive gun sales in this country.
So it's commercial?
To an extent, yeah. I mean, the ultimate motivation of the National Rifle Association is entirely commercial. It's about enhancing gun industry profits. And one thing you need to understand is that the National Rifle Association and the gun industry are intimately tied. So you have gun industry executives that are sitting directly on the NRA board of directors making decisions for the organization. And then you have what's called their Ring of Freedom program, where they receive tens of millions of dollars every year in direct corporate contributions from gun companies. So yeah, the NRA does better when the gun industry does better, and insurrectionist ideology really for the NRA is a way to convince a guy who already owns 4, 5, 6 guns essentially to buy a 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th, right? Because they have a customer base that's been shrinking over the decades. Gun ownership has been declining in this country since the 70s, and a need to continue to saturate that declining market. So insurrectionist ideology for them is simply a tool to do that, by convincing the guy that owns a hunting and self-defense firearm, oh, you better also buy that AR-15 if the government comes kicking at your door.
Do you think that the NRA lobby has bought, to say politically incorrect wording, the congressmen in Washington, so therefore they're really regulating the arms industry in their favor?
I think there's two elements to their power. One is certainly money, and money in politics is an incredibly corrosive factor in modern day America that really corrodes political equality, right? Because my vote doesn't mean as much as a guy that has $1 billion, obviously, anymore. But I think the other often unlooked element of their power is the fact that they've done a great job grassroots organizing. They have an incredibly motivated and dedicated core of activists that in many cases are single issue voters on this, so that when they go to the polls, if the candidate isn't pro-gun, doesn't matter how else they vote on other issues, these guys will not vote for them. And I think too infrequently on the other side, we haven't had, I guess what you'd call public safety voters that will only vote for a candidate if he votes for stronger gun laws. So I think we have two challenges, and I think since the Sandy Hook Elementary mass shooting, we've made tremendous progress in both areas. One would be closing the money gap, because sadly it is still an era of big money in politics, and we've done that chiefly through PACs established by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who runs Everytown for Gun Safety, and a PAC run by Gabby Giffords, the former congresswoman who was shot in the horrific Tucson mass shooting in 2011. And they've been able to raise money and get involved in some of these races, where now it's not just the guy saying, well, I know I'm going to face the money from the NRA on one side. They'll either be contributing to my campaign or running ads against me, but these gun violence prevention guys, I don't have to worry about them. Now they do have to worry about this. Now there's some money getting into play on both sides. And then the other area, of course, is grassroots energy. And since Sandy Hook, everything has changed for us. You have entirely new national grassroots organizations like Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. You have progressive groups that paid lip service to our issue before, but now are heavily vested in it. One example would be Organizing for America, President Obama's post-campaign organization. So you just have for us, you have a much more active picture on the ground day to day. And I think it's making a difference. I wouldn't argue that we're quite level with them yet in those two areas, but we're going to get there. And when we get there, I think things are going to change rapidly.
So you're pretty optimistic.
I'm very optimistic. I believe my faith or my thoughts on this are kind of reflected by something that Dr. King once said, Martin Luther King Jr., which is that, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I believe that. I think American history shows that.
If we go to the most popular slogan of the NRA, guns don't kill people, people kill people.
Yeah.
Are they right?
Well, yeah, maybe, but guns make it a heck of a lot easier, don't they? I was reading this great quote from Molly Ivins, a Texan who's no longer with us, but just a brilliant thinker on many social issues facing America. And she had this wonderful satirical quote where she's like, "I'm not anti-gun, I'm pro-knife, because we'll get more exercise that way. You'll actually have to run after the guy." And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. With a weapon like a knife, there's a need to close distance to kill on a personal level. You talked about, I think we started off talking about desensitization towards violence, and I think a gun is a weapon. It allows you to kill from a distance, right? It takes away some of the personalization of violence and makes it easier to kill. So yeah, no, there's a number of weapons out there, but none are more immediately available and lethal as firearms.
Analysts conclude that the gun violence, they say that is most common in poor urban areas. They said frequently associated with gang violence, often involving males, juveniles, and young adult males. Do you agree?
No, because when you say gun violence, when we just use the terms gun violence, we're talking about not only murder, we're talking also about suicides with guns and accidental deaths with firearms.
Which figures are you managing?
Well, I think there you were referring specifically to guns.
In general, I mean, how many people are being killed by guns in the
so
US?
from all those causes, it's 33,000 a year in this country. Homicide, suicide, accidental death.
In 2014, for example?
2013 is our most recent year for data, and it would be about 33,000.
Okay.
Yeah, and then another 70 or 80,000 shot and injured. So, I think it depends what type of gun violence you're talking about. Now, if you're talking about gun homicide, murders, yes, you will find higher rates of gun homicide typically in more populated urban areas that are experiencing other issues like, lack of employment, substance abuse, and things along those lines. If you're talking about gun suicide, and let's keep in mind, there's more gun suicides in this country every year than gun homicides, significantly more than rural areas.
Veterans also, they commit suicide 22 a day.
Yeah, 22 veterans are taking their lives a day, and male veterans are more likely to own firearms than the average American. So with the suicide problem, rural areas typically would have higher rates of gun suicide and also higher rates, obviously, of accidental firearm deaths. So, I think it's a problem where, depending on what state you're in, what region you're in, they might be affected differently by it. And there might, I think there is room, certainly on a state level, to tailor solutions a little bit differently depending on how you're experiencing a problem. But I think too often, particularly the gun lobby likes to portray this. When they talk about gun violence, they only want you to think of gun murder, right? They only want you to focus on cities. And they only want you to focus on gang violence. The FBI, the Uniform Crime Report that they put out, tells us that only 1 out of every 10 homicides are gang-related. But, the NRA wants you to believe that every gun death is, a young black man shooting someone else in a city. That's just not true. It's a far broader, more complicated problem than that, and it affects every region of this country, not just one.
How worrisome is for you what we have seen, for example, almost every week, that is police killing unarmed people? We're talking about, in terms of police killing people, so far this year, 825 people has been killed. About 60 or more unarmed, and about 40% of them black people. How worrisome is for you the usage of, if you want, the lethal shootings?
Yeah, it's very worrisome. I mean, you don't want to see that. We have an arms race in this country, but basically between police and civilians that's been going on for decades. There's a brilliant philanthropist in this country named Geoffrey Canada that wrote a great book about this called Fist, Stick, Knife, Gun. And he talked about the evolution of violence in the communities he grew up in, urban areas, over his lifetime, and how it went from, in the 60s, fist fights, maybe some guy had a switchblade. You get up into the 70s, all of a sudden people have revolvers and other types of guns. Now we're into the 80s and it's semi-automatic handguns. And then all of a sudden we're having assault rifles show up on city streets. So this has been an escalating arms race. And I think an element people need to understand is the police have not led that arms race. The police are responding to the types of weapons that they are seeing become commonplace in civilian hands. So just as one recent example, when our assault weapons ban expired at the federal level in 2004, when that ban expired, that was the point at which our urban police departments, and actually not just urban, also some suburban and rural police departments began to carry AR-15s in their trunks along with that shotgun. And this has been the way it's gone. You know, you go back to the time when I was a kid, it was revolvers. Then the police upgrade to semi-automatic handguns in the 80s, and this is just the pattern. So the point I'm trying to make is I think, a lot of times I think it's probably easy to assume that, the police that are engaged in these shootings or that are pulling their guns are violence prone or they want to go out and take a life. I think probably the truth is more commonly they're just scared out of their wits that the person that they're dealing with could be armed. I mean, consider the type of people that we allow to legally buy guns in this country, to pass background checks. You can look at every recent mass shooter we've had, clearly dangerous individuals who are legally getting guns. And you understand the fear of even a routine patrol officer when they do a traffic stop or God forbid, a domestic violence call. The threat is very real to them, and I think it's easy to point the finger at them and say, well, you guys are overreacting in every case. I think what's more realistic if we want to tamp this down is we really need to have both sides de-escalate. You have to have the police being willing to put down some arms, and I think we saw the worst side of that in Ferguson where they came out like a military force.
Exactly, and even was a militia, they called the Oath.
The Oath Keepers. Yeah. Well, that's a whole, that's the insurrectionist arm. Yeah. Right. But I mean, but with the police, I mean, the worst side was probably this militarized police, right? That you saw in Ferguson. Sometimes they just blatantly go too far, and they should be called on that. But I think what we need to realize long term is that the weapons that the police face in civilian hands in this country is unprecedented, and there really is a threat to them. So, if we really want to solve that, let's get policies in place that de-escalate on both sides.
If you want to be a skeptic, and we're going back to the NRA, how important for the U.S. economy is the gun industry?
Well, I'm not an economist. I can't give you an expert answer on that. But the gun industry is not particularly large compared to other industries. It is a multi-billion-dollar industry. It's been on kind of rough skids as of late. There's been some bankruptcies declared. There's been other countries that are having problems finding investors on Wall Street. So it's had its ups and downs. Can America survive without a robust gun industry? Yeah, probably. Would that be a difficult challenge to face in a kind of a post-manufacturing economic climate in this country? Potentially. There are some good people out there that work in the gun industry that need those jobs. But to me, it's not necessarily about disbanding the gun industry. It's simply about making them operate in a more responsible manner. And that doesn't have to do with manufacturing guns. It has to do with how they distribute and market weapons.
Your fight, given the fact that, according to you, violence is not something that is an epidemic, intrinsic part of the American fabric, you are very much into gun law control. You're really working with the laws to try to regulate more the ownership of guns.
Well, yeah, I mean, specifically, most importantly, regulation at the point of purchase so that when you go to buy a gun, we're actually really checking for your criminal and mental health history and determining if there are actually factors in the background that make you more likely to engage in violent behavior in the future. That's first and foremost. But also, the gun industry itself is very lightly regulated as an industry.
Lightly. Very
lightly, yeah. There's not much regulation there. So as one example, the gun industry receives protection from civil litigation, from lawsuits, from citizens that no other industry in this country enjoys. That truly is unprecedented, and one of the big issues that's arisen in the Democratic presidential candidate primary race is that Bernie Sanders from Vermont, the senator from Vermont here, supports that level of gun industry immunity from civil litigation. So that's just one example, I think, and there are many, of how protected this industry is. So there's many things we need to do. I don't think we need to stop people from owning firearms for legitimate purposes.
You do not?
No, not at all, no. I mean, I think, for folks, I've been doing this now for about 15 years. I've never spent a day in my life doing any work that has to do with hunting or sports shooting, or the guy that just, for example, wants to keep a shotgun on his home for self-defense. None of what we do has to do with that. This is about basically an industry being allowed to run rampant without proper regulation, and where it's reached a point that even people who are obviously dangerous, who are literally lifting their hands up in the air and screaming, I am violent, and everyone knows it around them, are being allowed to legally buy guns. And that's the cause of some of the true mayhem you're seeing in this country.
So what will be your next step?
The next step for us needs to be universal background checks. So basically the way the system operates in this country is you have licensed gun dealers, that would be like Bob's Gun Shop on the street corner, that are required to get a federal license to deal in firearms and must run background checks on buyers. But then in this country, in the overwhelming majority of states, you have a parallel stream of commerce where private individuals theoretically not engaged in the business of dealing firearms, are allowed to sell guns without conducting any background checks on their buyers and without maintaining any records of sale.
You say cash and carry.
Cash and carry. If we were both Virginia residents, it would be legal for me as a seller to meet you in a McDonald's parking lot without even knowing your name and sell you 4 AR-15s out of my trunk and 6,000 rounds of ammunition without even knowing your name, much less looking for a license or running a background check on you.
And that happens today?
It could, yeah. Private sales are happening in Virginia and all over this country as we speak right now, absolutely.
So the challenge is immense?
Well, the challenge is immense, but the solution is simple. The solution is simply a federal law that for the first time would regulate private sales and require background checks.
But what if the congressmen are all bought, quote unquote, by the lobbyists?
Well, again, I think to an extent we have to play hardball right now. I think for a long time the gun violence prevention movement suffered because we tried to be too polite. We tried to appeal to people's hearts, and I can't tell you how many people we had tell us behind closed doors, well, I'm with you guys on this one, I really am, but the NRA's coming after me, they're ringing my phone off the hook, so we have to play hardball. We have to be willing to get involved in this and sometimes get our hands a little dirty, and that's going to mean, at least for the near future, raising money to be part of the money game in politics. And grassroots organizing, good old-fashioned ringing their phones off the hooks, showing up at their town hall meetings and asking rather urgent questions about guns, tough questions of them. All the things that the NRA has done well for a number of years. I think to some extent it's easy to complain about the control the NRA has, but there's a few lessons to be learned there. They've done some things by the book and well, and grassroots organizing being one of them. Again, the money picture, I do hope we reach a point in this country where we're back to full political equality, one person, one vote. But for the time being, we have to be raising money ourselves and being ready to reward candidates or politicians who vote the right way and to punish those who don't.
Ladd Everett, thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure being here. Thank you.